On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel, without even a formal declaration of war, launched a massive attack on Iran, striking military bases, government facilities, and cities across the country. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the initial assault, along with numerous other officials and an unknown number of civilians. Schools, hospitals, and cultural heritage sites were damaged or destroyed. Within days, the United States had dropped 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs on Iranian missile sites along the Straits of Hormuz. A U.S. submarine torpedoed and sank the Iranian frigate IRIS Dina in the Indian Ocean, a vessel the Pentagon knew to be unarmed as it was returning from a multinational naval exercise that required participating ships to carry no ammunition. 80 crew members were killed. It was the first ship sunk by an American submarine since World War II. As of this lecture, more than 1,500 people have been killed in Iran, including at least 160 in an American missile strike at a girls' school. Over 4,000 civilian buildings have been damaged. In self-defense, Iran has responded with missile and drone strikes across the Gulf region, hitting targets in Israel, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil ordinarily flows, has been effectively closed. Oil prices have surged beyond $110 a barrel. The International Energy Agency has described the situation as, quote, the greatest global energy security challenge in history. 20,000 seafarers are stranded in the Gulf. International shipping in that region has grounded to a halt. This is the real thing. This is a war, not an episode. It is a war. President Trump has demanded Iran's unconditional surrender. In other words, that Iran accept its transformation into an enslaved colony. This is the type of language, I think I don't have to remind you, that was employed by Hitler against the countries he invaded. He has threatened to strike Iran's nuclear plants and power grids, which, by the way, is illegal. He has declared that regime change will happen. The United States Defense Secretary has said the military will not relent until the enemy is totally and decisively defeated. American intelligence's own assessments, meanwhile, have concluded that Iran's alleged long-range ballistic missile threat to the United States is unfounded, with such capabilities requiring development until at least 2035. The attack was launched on the very night that Omani mediators reported major progress in nuclear negotiations, and that Iran had agreed in principle to zero out its enriched new uranium stockpile. Iran's foreign minister had publicly stated that a historic agreement to avert war was within reach. But the United States chose war, an undeclared war, over a negotiated settlement. The danger of a widening conflagration is not hypothetical. It is an active variable in the calculations of every government on earth. The historic parallel that imposes itself is not the Gulf War of 1991 or the invasion of Iraq in 2003, as criminal as those operations were, but August 1914. The First World War began as a regional conflict in the Balkans and expanded through the logic of alliances, imperial rivalries, and miscalculation into a global catastrophe that destroyed 4 empires and killed 20 million people. The mechanisms of escalation in the present crisis are no less dangerous. The interconnection of the Iran war with the conflicts in Ukraine, the South China Sea, and the broader U.S. confrontation with both Russia and China means that a single incident, a stray missile striking a NATO member, a naval confrontation in the Gulf, an attack on a nuclear facility, could trigger a chain of events that no government has the capacity to control. The working class and all of humanity confront a situation that Trotsky described so prophetically on the eve of World War II. He wrote, "The ruling class now toboggans with closed eyes toward an economic and military catastrophe." This war is a crime against peace. Verbrechen gegen Frieden. The first and most fundamental charge in the indictment brought against the Nazi leadership at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg in 1945-46. 13 of the defendants were found guilty of waging wars of aggression. 11 were hanged on October 16, 1946. Hermann Göring, Hitler's second in command, escaped the noose by swallowing cyanide just hours before his scheduled execution. The chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, opened the trial with words that remain the most authoritative statement of the principle that international law binds the powerful no less than the powerless. Quote, "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." Jackson insisted that the law established at Nuremberg could not be applied selectively. Quote, "While this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment." And he stated with a bluntness that indicts the entire subsequent history of American foreign policy and the present leaders of the United States, any resort to war, to any kind of war, is a resort to means that are inherently criminal. An honestly defensive war is, of course, legal. But inherently criminal acts cannot be defended by showing that those who committed them were engaged in a war when war itself is illegal. By the standard Jackson articulated and the tribunal enforced, the war against Iran is an aggressive war launched without provocation, without authorization from the United Nations Security Council, without a declaration of war by the U.S. Congress, and in violation of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. Iran had not attacked the United States. It posed no imminent threat to the United States. It was in the process of negotiating a comprehensive agreement. The European imperialist powers, including Germany, are entirely complicit in this crime. Their differences with Washington, to the extent that they exist, are of a purely tactical character. The European Union issued a statement on March 1st that did not condemn the US-Israeli surprise attack, but instead denounced Iran's retaliatory strikes as inexcusable. The European Council, quote, strongly condemned Iran's indiscriminate military strikes, unquote, while calling only for, quote, maximum restraint, unquote, and the protection of civilians. Language addressed to both sides as if the aggressor and the victims of aggressor were moral equivalents. Germany's Chancellor Merz described Iran as, quote, a major security threat, and argued that decades of diplomacy have failed. France deployed its aircraft carrier to the region to protect French interests. For 4 years, as you all know, these same European governments have denounced what they call Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine, a war that was in fact hardly unprovoked, having arisen directly out of the relentless eastward expansion of NATO and the systematic effort to transform Ukraine into a forward base for imperialism against Russia. But let us accept, for the sake of argument, the Europeans' own framing. They have invoked international law, the sanctity of sovereignty, the inviolability of borders. They have imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia and supplied Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars in weapons. Yet confronted with an indisputably unprovoked war launched by their principal ally, the United States, against a nation of 91 million people, a war that has killed more than 1,500 civilians, probably far more, closed the world's most important shipping lane, and threatens nuclear catastrophe, they have not uttered a single word of opposition. The so-called rules-based international order has been exposed once again as a cynical euphemism for the right of the imperialist powers to make war on whomever they choose. Now, it is necessary to address the narrative that has come to dominate virtually all public discussion of this war, particularly in the United States, on both the right and the left. That narrative holds that the war against Iran is to be explained primarily, and in some versions exclusively, as the product of Israeli and Zionist influence over American foreign policy. According to this account, the United States has no independent interest in conflict with Iran, was manipulated or coerced into war by Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli lobby, and would pursue an entirely different course in the Middle East if freed from this malign influence. In the United States, this interpretation has been advanced most aggressively by figures on the nationalist right. Tucker Carlson, the most influential voice in this camp, declared on March 3rd, 2026, quote, "This happened because Israel wanted it to happen. This is Israel's war. This is not the United States' war." Carlson went on, asserting that, quote, "The United States didn't make the decision here, Benjamin Netanyahu did," unquote. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, has argued in the same vein. Speaking 2 days before the war began, Macgregor stated, "I think he recognizes that he has not much choice. We have to understand who put him, Trump, into the White House and the enormous power and influence of the Israel lobby and the Zionist billionaires in the United States that contribute to it." In a post on social media after the war began, Macgregor asked, "For what? So Israel, that started this insane war, can drag America into a wider regional conflict. This narrative has been largely accepted with varying degrees of sophistication by the left liberal opposition as well. Jeffrey Sachs, the Columbia University economist, has described the war as driven by, quote, two malignant narcissists, Netanyahu and Trump, and frames the conflict primarily as an Israeli project for greater Israel and regional hegemony. Figures such as Max Blumenthal and Chris Hedges and organizations like Code Pink, which adopted the slogan, "We won't die for Israel's war," have framed the conflict in essentially the same terms as the nationalist right, as a war fought for Israel, not America. It is indisputable that the Israeli lobby is real and that it expends immense resources to influence American policy. There is no question that Israel has sought this war for decades, that Netanyahu provided the intelligence on Khamenei's location that made the February 28th strike possible, and that the Israeli regime, which has practiced genocide in Gaza and whose character is increasingly and unmistakably fascistic, bears enormous responsibility for the catastrophe now engulfing the Middle East. The World Socialist Web Site has been second to none in its opposition to the Israeli state, an opposition that dates back to 1948, when the Fourth International opposed the formation of the State of Israel. The struggle, ideological and political, waged by Marxism against Zionism dates all the way back to the 1880s. Trotsky himself described Zionism as the promotion of a reactionary utopia with potentially catastrophic consequences. His warning has been realized. However, the explanation of the war as not only primarily, but even solely a product of Zionist influence is profoundly wrong, not only as a historical analysis, but as a political perspective. It leads, whether its proponents intended or not, to an apology for and even alignment with American imperialism. If the problem is only Israeli influence, then the solution is to remove that influence and replace it with a good foreign policy that defends genuine all-American interests. Foreign policy becomes a matter of hygiene, of purging a foreign contaminant from an otherwise healthy body politic. This perspective is closely related to the reactionary and essentially anti-Semitic tradition that asserts a fundamental distinction between healthy and productive Christian capitalism and parasitic, usurious, Jewish-dominated finance capital. Well, that was Hitler's argument in the 1930s. It is no accident that Carlson's commentary has migrated within days from criticisms of Israel's foreign policy to conspiracy theories about Jewish control of the American state. What's the truth? First of all, it must not be forgotten that Israel owes its existence to the United States. The Truman administration was the first government to recognize Israel in 1948. Israel is a vicious attack dog, but its leash is held by the United States. In the final analysis, the Israeli state is able to wield such immense influence because its interests are so closely aligned with U.S. imperialism. If that were not the case, the United States would deal with the Israeli lobby as ruthlessly as it did with the powerful pro-Nazi German-American Bund in the early 1940s. In the case of the present war, the Israel-centric narrative detaches the conflict from any coherent historical, geopolitical, socioeconomic, and class analysis of the origins, causes, and aims of the war. It essentially abandons imperialism as an analytical framework. It entirely ignores the long and pernicious role of British, German, and finally American imperialism in the oppression of Persia, Iran. The issue of oil, the material foundation of the entire conflict, is pushed into the background. It totally disconnects this war from the protracted struggle waged by the United States against Iran since 1979, aimed at reversing the results of the Iranian Revolution, which has included vicious financial sanctions, military attacks, the use of proxies, Iraq and Israel, as well as the Gulf states, and finally the past 35 years of wars waged by the United States and its NATO allies across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Moreover, the Israel-centric interpretation severs the link between the war and the ongoing preparations of the United States for war against Russia and China. As the World Socialist Web Site has stressed, the aim of the United States is to abolish all the residual traces of the social and democratic revolutions of the 20th century, and to reorganize the world under the hegemonic control of the United States. This project is driven not simply by evil intentions, let alone the madness and criminality of Donald Trump, but by the imperatives of American capitalism. That is, to reverse the protracted deterioration of the global financial and industrial position of the United States through war. Trump himself was brought to power by the American ruling class. His presidency is the product not of a popular insurgency, but of the deliberate decisions by dominant sections of the financial oligarchy to install in the White House a figure willing to employ the methods of the criminal underworld in the conduct of both domestic and foreign policy. The well-known Epstein affair, in which a vast section of the financial and political elite is implicated in crimes of the most sordid character, offers a glimpse into the social milieu from which the Trump administration emerged. The war against Iran is being conducted by a government that is itself the expression of the terminal degeneration of American bourgeois democracy. Inseparably connected to the global imperatives of American capitalism is the use of war as a means of violently suppressing domestic working-class opposition to the ruling capitalist oligarchy and the entire structure of capitalist exploitation. The war in Iran, which followed the attack on Venezuela and the ongoing efforts to strangle Cuba, neither of which is related to Zionist interests, has developed against the backdrop of the fascistic paramilitary violence of ICE, the anti-immigrant fascistic police force, which is responsible for the murder of American citizens and the brutal persecution of the immigrant population. The logic of this war is not merely the logic of the Israel lobby. It is the logic of imperialism in its epoch of historical crisis. To demonstrate this, it is necessary to review the actual history of the American relationship with Iran, a history that long predates the modern Israeli state and that is rooted not in Zionist machinations, but in oil, geopolitical control, and the class interests of American capitalism. To understand why the United States has been waging war, economic, covert, and now openly militarily, against Iran for nearly half a century, one must begin not with ideology, but with geography. Iran sits at the intersection of three critical zones of the world economy: Central Asia, South Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Iran possesses the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves and the second largest natural gas reserves. Moreover, Iran commands the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which, prior to the current war, approximately 20% of the world's oil supply transited daily. No serious strategist in Washington has ever failed to understand this. The struggle over Iran has never been, in its essence, about terrorism, about nuclear weapons, about human rights, or even about Israel. They have all served as pretexts, rationalizations, and instruments. The fundamental issue has always been the same: who controls the oil resources of the Persian Gulf, and on what terms? The imperialist powers grasped this long before the United States entered the scene. Britain began extracting Iranian oil in 1908 through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and eventually British Petroleum. I think you've all heard of that company. For the first half of the 20th century, Iran was effectively a British semi-colony. Its oil wealth extracted by foreign corporations, its politics shaped by the British embassy, its nominal sovereignty merely nominal. Germany too recognized Iran's strategic importance. Under the Kaiser, German capital competed for influence in Persia as part of the broader rivalry with Britain, a rivalry that contributed to the outbreak of World War I. During the Second World War, the Nazis cultivated relations with Reza Shah Pahlavi, whose Germanophile tendencies alarmed the Allies sufficiently to justify the Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. The British seized the southern oil fields. The Soviets occupied the north. Iran's sovereignty was, as so often, dispensed with when it conflicted with great power interests. It was into this arena of inter-imperialist competition that the United States entered during the Second World War, and it has never left. This is not a secret. The 2025 National Security Strategy of the United States stated it with unusual candor. Quote, "America will always have core interests in ensuring that Gulf energy supplies do not fall into the hands of an outright enemy, and that the Strait of Hormuz remain open." That single sentence, written by Trump's own national security apparatus, demolishes the claim that the United States has no independent interest in a war in Iran. The strategic importance of Iran to American imperialism was first recognized not in 1979 and not in 2001, but during the Second World War. In November 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin convened at the Tehran Conference, the first meeting of the so-called Big Three, in the capital of Iran. The choice of location was itself significant. Iran had been jointly invaded and occupied by Britain and the Soviet Union in August 1941, and it served as the critical supply corridor through which American Lend-Lease material reached the Soviet front. At Tehran, the three leaders issued a joint declaration pledging to respect Iran's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, and promising economic assistance after the war. But the conference also led Roosevelt to confront a reality that would shape American grand strategy for the next 8 decades. Whoever controlled Iran controlled the gateway to the richest oil reserves on Earth. The first great power confrontation of the Cold War did not occur in Berlin or in Korea. It occurred in Iran. Under the wartime occupation agreement, all Allied forces were to withdraw from Iran within 6 months after the end of hostilities. The United States and Britain withdrew on schedule, but the Soviet forces remained. The Truman administration, which had adopted a posture of toughness toward the former wartime ally, treated the Iranian crisis as a test case for the emerging doctrine of containment. The United States pressured the Soviet Union through the newly created United Nations Security Council, one of the first issues the body ever considered, and through direct diplomatic confrontation. Under combined pressure, the Soviets withdrew from Iran in May 1946. The significance of this episode cannot be overstated. Iran was the first arena in which the United States asserted its will against the USSR and prevailed. It established the pattern, the defense of Western access to Persian Gulf oil as a core strategic imperative, and that has governed American policy in the region ever since. And it established Iran as an American client state, a status that would be formalized and deepened over the next 3 decades. The critical episode in the history of U.S.-Iran relations, from which everything else follows, occurred on August 19, 1953, when the CIA and British intelligence overthrew the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mossadegh and reinstalled the Shah as Iran's absolute ruler. What had Mossadegh done? He had nationalized Iran's oil industry. Since 1908, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had extracted Iran's oil wealth while paying the Iranian government a fraction of the revenue. When Mossadegh moved to reclaim national control of this resource, Britain imposed an embargo and a blockade, and then turned to the United States for assistance in removing Mossadegh from power. The Eisenhower administration, presented with the opportunity by the British and motivated by both Cold War fears and the desire of American oil companies to gain access to Iranian concessions, authorized the CIA to execute the coup. The operation, codenamed Ajax, was led by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and cousin of the CIA agent Archibald Roosevelt Jr., who would later surface as an advisor to David Rockefeller at the Chase Manhattan Bank. Some 300 people were killed in the fighting in Tehran. In the coup's aftermath, the Shah consolidated absolute power. The secret police, Savak, was created with the CIA and Israeli Mossad assistance. Major General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., father of the later Gulf War commander, was sent by the CIA to train the security forces that would enforce the Shah's rule. Oil was reorganized under a new consortium in which 5 American companies now shared the spoils alongside the renamed British Petroleum, Shell, and French interests. The crushing of Iran's democratic experiment had served its purpose. American capital now had direct access to Iranian oil. The claim that the United States has no interest in conflict with Iran is refuted not only by the historical record, but by the U.S. government's own classified and published strategic documents, which have identified Iran as a critical American interest continuously since the 1950s. The documentary trail begins immediately after the 1953 coup. A statement of that year, the first comprehensive statement of U.S. policy toward Iran after Mossadegh's overthrow, established the framework. Iran was to be maintained as a pro-Western client state, its military supported, its oil flowing to Western markets. By 1958, another major statement adopted by the Eisenhower National Security Council stated the matter with characteristic bluntness. Quote, Iran's strategic location between the USSR and the Persian Gulf and its great oil interests make it critically important to the United States that Iran's friendship, independence, and territorial integrity be maintained. Of course, when they spoke of independence, they meant an independence controlled by the United States. The document authorized the employment of American armed forces to oversee Iran's territorial integrity. From 1953 until 1979, the Shah served as Washington's gendarme of the Persian Gulf, a phrase used in American strategic doctrine following the Nixon Doctrine of 1969, which held that regional allies, rather than American ground forces, should police the developing world on Washington's behalf. Between 1970 and 1978, the Shah ordered and received $20 billion worth of American weaponry, what one member of Congress called, quote, the most rapid buildup of military power under peacetime conditions of any nation in the history of the world, unquote. It did this without asking Israel's permission or listening to Israeli objections. Iran became the single largest customer for U.S. arms exports. Grumman, Bell Helicopter, Northrop, Rockwell International, and dozens of other American defense contractors made billions of dollars from this relationship. By 1973, an estimated 3,600 American technicians were working on arms-related projects inside Iran, with the number projected to reach 25,000 by 1980. No one's talking about this today in the media. Have you read any article about this recently? Has this been part of the discussion of the background of the war? So if I'm taking time to go over this, it's because you will hear it nowhere else. You won't hear it on television. You won't find it in any of the organized discussions, certainly the official discussions on the nature of this war. And if I have spent so much time trying to clarify the question of the relationship of Zionism and Israel to this war, it's not as an apology for Zionism, but in order to provide a correct understanding of the real dynamics of world imperialism, which is essential for the development of a serious anti-war policy. Even in common neighborhood law, if you're bitten by a wild dog, it's the owner who's responsible. And that's the issue that arises with Israel. Now, Chase Manhattan Bank, under David Rockefeller, syndicated more than $1.7 billion in loans for Iranian projects, approximately $5.8 billion in today's dollars. The Chase balance sheet held over $360 million in direct loans to Iran and more than $500 million in Iranian deposits. The financial, military, and intelligence relationship between the United States and the Shah's regime was not a diplomatic alliance in the ordinary sense. It was a system of imperial extraction and control, lubricated by arms sales and banking profits, enforced by a secret police, trained by the CIA, and justified by the Cold War. Savak, the instrument of internal repression, was notorious. It operated with what the record describes as a loose leash to employ torture against suspected dissidents. Hundreds of people were executed for political reasons during the Shah's final 2 decades in power. Thousands were imprisoned, and the population of Iran knew that the Shah's power rested not on any domestic legitimacy, but on the 1953 coup and the continuing support of the United States. Now here this intersects with an important chapter in German history. In this city, the American relationship with the Shah did not exist in isolation. It was embedded in a broader Western alliance in which the major European powers, and particularly the Federal Republic of Germany, were willing and profitable partners. Under Chancellors Adenauer, Erhard, and Kiesinger, what did they say? Der Alte, der Dicke, und der Nazi, the German government cultivated close relations with the Shah's regime. Germany was a major trading partner and investor in Iranian infrastructure. The West German government received the Shah with the full honors of a democratic ally, despite his well-documented record of political repression, torture, and murder. The Shah was anti-communist, he had oil to sell, and that was all that mattered. The complicity of the German state in the Shah's dictatorship was exposed with devastating brutality on June 2nd, 1967, when the Shah visited West Berlin during the chancellorship of Kurt Georg Kiesinger, himself a former member of the Nazi Party, students and exiled Iranians organized a protest near the Deutsche Oper, where the Shah was attending a performance of Mozart's Der Zauberflöte. Agents of Savak, the Shah's secret police, operating under the protection of the Berlin police, attacked the demonstrators with wooden staves. The police then launched what the journalist Sebastian Haffner described as, quote, a cold-bloodedly planned pogrom. More than 45 demonstrators in Berlin were so brutally assaulted that they required hospitalization. The conservative Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung concluded that the police had, quote, without any serious necessity, responded with a planned brutality when associates with newspaper reports from fascist or semi-fascist countries. But the worst was the following. During the assault, 26-year-old student Benno Onizork, married, with his wife expecting their first child, and attending his first political demonstration, was cornered in a courtyard. 3 policemen held him, while plainclothes detective Karl-Heinz Kuras shot him in the back of the head. Onizork was unarmed. He had attacked no one. Hospital records were falsified, and an attempt was made to conceal the bullet wound. The murder of Kuras was tried and acquitted. The murder of Benno Onizork became the catalytic event of the German student movement and the broader radicalization of 1968. But for the purposes of this lecture, its significance lies elsewhere. It demonstrated that the Shah's apparatus of repression operated not only inside Iran, but on the streets of Western capitals with the active complicity of Western governments. The dictatorship that the United States had installed in 1953 was maintained not only by American arms and American money, but by the collaborative support of the entire Western imperialist alliance. When the revolution finally came in February 1979, it represented one of the most devastating strategic defeats suffered by American imperialism in the post-war era. Comparable in its consequences, though not in its form, to the loss of China in 1949. In a matter of weeks, the United States lost its most powerful regional ally, its principal intelligence platform overlooking the Soviet Union southern border, its largest arms customer, its gendarme of the Persian Gulf, and the cooperative framework through which American and British capital extracted Iranian oil wealth. The entire architecture of American power in the Gulf region, painstakingly constructed since 1946, collapsed. The revolution was driven by decades of accumulated grievances against the Shah's autocracy, his Savak secret police, the vast corruption of the royal court, the dislocations produced by rapid but uneven modernization, and the suffocating inequality of a society in which oil wealth enriched a tiny elite while millions lived in poverty. But the United States was inseparable from the Shah in the Iranian popular consciousness. The 1953 coup was a living memory. The tens of thousands of American military and corporate personnel in the country were a visible daily presence. The revolution, whatever its internal dynamics, was inevitably experienced as a liberation from American domination. It is this loss, not any subsequent Iranian action, that explains the 46-year campaign of hostility that followed. The United States has never accepted the outcome of the Iranian Revolution. Every subsequent policy, the support for Iraq and the Iran-Iraq War, the destruction of Iran's navy, the shooting down of a civilian airliner, the decades of sanctions, the assassination of Soleimani, the bombing of nuclear facilities, and now the full-scale war of 2026 has been directed toward a single goal: reversing the strategic defeat of 1979, either by bringing Iran back under American control or by destroying its capacity to function as an independent nation state. The Carter Doctrine of 1980 announced in the wake of the revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, declared that any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States and would be repelled by military force. This doctrine has never been rescinded. In January 2002, Bush designated Iran as part of an axis of evil, at a moment when Iran was actually actively collaborating with the United States against the Taliban. The 2006 National Security Strategy warned that, quote, all necessary measures would be taken against Iran. The 2017 strategy named Iran alongside North Korea as a rogue state. The 2025 National Security Strategy, as noted earlier, designated Iran as an outright enemy and identified Gulf energy as a core Iranian interest. The 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, passed with bipartisan congressional support, named Iran as a U.S. adversary. Iran has been among the 5 most referenced countries in every strategy document since 2006. This is not a function of any single president or party, and it is not a product of the Israel lobby. It is an institutional consensus of the American national security state, maintained across 4 decades, rooted in the interests of American capitalism in Persian Gulf energy resources and regional military hegemony. The geopolitical and economic interests that drive U.S. policy toward Iran are hidden from the American people. In the imperialist narrative that dominates the U.S. media, Iran is cast as the ruthless aggressor against a blameless America. According to this narrative, Iranian terrorism began with the unprovoked seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the taking of hostages in November 1979. The immediate trigger for the hostage crisis that formalized the U.S.-Iran rupture deserves close examination because it reveals the class interest that drove American policy from the very beginning and which persists to this day. After the Shah fled Iran in January 1979, President Carter initially refused to admit him to the United States. Carter wanted to establish relations with the new government and was warned by his own embassy staff that admitting the Shah would endanger American diplomats in Tehran. The charge d'affaires, Bruce Langan, explicitly warned that the risk of the embassy being overrun was high. Carter himself, at a key meeting, asked his advisors what they would tell him to do, quote, after the embassy was overrun, acknowledging that he understood the likely consequences. What changed Carter's mind about admitting the Shah was not humanitarianism, but a sustained lobbying campaign organized once again by David Rockefeller, chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank. Rockefeller's team called the operation Project Eagle. He mobilized Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, who chaired a Chase advisory board, John J. McCoy, a future Chase chairman and advisor to 8 presidents, Archibald Roosevelt, a Chase executive and former CIA agent, whose cousin had orchestrated the 1953 coup, and Richard Helms, former CIA director and former ambassador to Iran. The overlap between the CIA network that had installed the Shah in 1953 and the banking network that lobbied to protect its investment in his regime was not coincidental. It was the same network. Rockefeller's financial interest was direct and substantial. As I pointed out, Chase had over $1 billion in Iranian assets. The new Iranian government was demanding the return of these assets. A withdrawal of that magnitude could have created a liquidity crisis for a bank already struggling with financial difficulties. Rockefeller had every reason to prevent the normalization of U.S.-Iranian relations. Carter was also misled about the Shah's medical condition. He was told the Shah was near death and could only be treated in New York. The examining physician subsequently confirmed that neither claim was true. The treatment could have been provided anywhere, including Mexico, where the Shah was already residing. On October 21st, 1979, Carter admitted the Shah. 12 days later, the embassy was seized. After the seizure, Chase's actions further inflamed the crisis. The bank refused to accept a $4 million interest payment from Iran on its due date, then unilaterally declared the Iranian government in default on the entire loan without consulting the other banks and the syndicates. Within a year of the revolution, Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, and the United States sided with Iraq. The Reagan administration determined that Iraq's defeat would be contrary to U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf. A National Security Decision Directive of November 1983 made the objective explicit: to project American military force in the Gulf and protect oil supplies. On December 20th, 1983, President Reagan dispatched Donald Rumsfeld to Baghdad as his special envoy. Rumsfeld met with Saddam Hussein for 90 minutes, and the two men shook hands for the cameras, a handshake that became one of the iconic images of American foreign policy. At the time of Rumsfeld's visit, the United States was secretly aware that Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers on an almost daily basis. There is evidence that the battlefield intelligence provided by the U.S. helped Iraq calibrate its gas attacks more effectively. Rumsfeld did not raise the issue of chemical weapons with Saddam. Full diplomatic relations between Washington and Baghdad were restored 11 months later. The Reagan administration removed Iraq from the State Department list of state-sponsored terrorism in 1984. The same year, it placed Iran on the list. The U.S. Senate Banking Committee subsequently documented that the Reagan and Bush administrations authorized the sale to Iraq of dual-use items, including chemical precursors and biological agents such as anthrax and bubonic plague. The administration also engineered the sale of Bell helicopters, ostensibly for civilian use. Saddam's military used them to attack Kurdish civilians with poison gas in 1988. When the U.S. Senate unanimously passed sweeping sanctions against Iraq in response to the gassing of Kurds, the White House killed the measure. The United States defended Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons until the very day Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990. As Saddam Hussein should have foreseen, his collaboration with U.S. imperialism did not protect him against U.S. reprisals after he transgressed American oil interests in Kuwait. Eventually, Hussein's life ended at the end of an American rope. In 1987, the U.S. launched Operation Earnest Will to escort Kuwaiti tankers, Kuwait being one of Iraq's principal financial backers, to the Persian Gulf. In April 1988, the U.S. launched Operation Praying Mantis, the largest U.S. naval engagement since World War II, which destroyed a significant portion of the Iranian Navy. 3 months later, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian airliner, on a scheduled route to Dubai, killing all 290 passengers and crew. The United States has never formally apologized for this crime. The commanding officer was later awarded the Legion of Merit. One can go on in greater detail. It is a long and terrible record. To briefly sum this up, any claim that Iran has somehow acted as a criminal regime, carrying out wild acts of terror against an innocent West, is nothing but a lie. And it can be believed only on the basis of the most unlimited ignorance of historical and political reality. This war is only the latest chapter of a relentless campaign to destroy the Iranian state and reestablished unfettered American control. Now, this war marks an irrevocable turning point. The world that existed before February 28th, 2026 is gone. It's been dying for some time. The sheer criminality of the entire rule-based international order has been laid bare for the world to see. An entire nation has been subjected to saturation bombing by the world's most powerful military in an act of unprovoked aggression, while the international community, that is, the gang of criminals that presides over our states, our regimes, our governments, watches in silence or offers its complicity. When Nazi Germany and fascist Italy bombed the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937, the horror reverberated around the world. Picasso painted his masterpiece in response. When the Luftwaffe bombed Rotterdam in May 1940, killing nearly 900 people, it was denounced as an act of barbarism that shocked civilized opinion. Today, the United States and Israel are conducting a sustained aerial campaign against Iranian cities. Well over 1,000 people have been killed, thousands of buildings reduced to rubble, a girls' school obliterated, and the response of the so-called democratic world is to condemn Iran for defending itself. This is not a matter of warning about World War III as though it were some future eventuality that might still be averted by appeals to reason or the election of better leaders. We are witnessing the rapid intensification of a third world war. Ukraine, Gaza, Venezuela, Iran, these are not separate conflicts. They are fronts in a single global war being waged by American imperialism, European imperialism, to reorganize the world under their hegemonic control, to abolish the residual traces of the social and democratic revolutions of the past century, and to crush by force any state or movement that resists the subordination to the dictates of Washington and Wall Street. We live in a world that Lenin, Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and above all Trotsky would understand very well. The same contradictions they analyzed between the global character of the productive forces and the nation-state system, between the social character of production and the private appropriation of wealth, between the drive of each imperialist power to dominate and the impossibility of any single power achieving unchallenged hegemony, are driving the world toward catastrophe with the same remorseless logic that these great Marxist leaders described a century ago. The struggle against war is an international question. It cannot be waged only within national boundaries, and it cannot be entrusted to any existing government. No amount of protest, however massive, directed at the existing capitalist states will stop the drive to war. The mass demonstrations of 2003 did not stop the invasion of Iraq. The worldwide outcry against the genocide in Gaza did not stop it. Appeals to the rules-based order will not stop the bombing of Iran. The bombing of Iran is precisely the operation of the imperialist rules-based order. All such appeals to the existing powers will not stop the relentless escalation toward nuclear war. The decisive question, the only question that ultimately matters, is the development of revolutionary leadership in the international working class. This is not a new insight. It was a central conclusion drawn by Leon Trotsky from the catastrophes of the first half of the 20th century, and it has lost none of its force. In the founding document of the transitional program, of the Fourth International, the transitional program of 1938, Trotsky wrote, and I quote, All talk to the effect that historical conditions have not ripened for socialism is the product of ignorance or conscious deception. The objective prerequisites for the proletarian revolution have not only ripened, they have begun to get somewhat rotten. Without a socialist revolution in the next historical period at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole culture of mankind. The turn is now to the proletariat, chiefly to its revolutionary vanguard. The historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership. That assessment, written on the eve of the Second World War and the horrors that followed, defines with even greater precision the crisis of the present moment. The objective conditions for the overthrow of capitalism are not merely ripe. They are, as Trotsky warned, beginning to rot. The alternative is not reform or revolution, but revolution or catastrophe. The task of building the revolutionary leadership of the working class, which is represented by the International Committee of the Fourth International and its sections, is the urgent, overriding, and inescapable political task of our time. Thank you very much for your attention.